So this is our reading portion for Rhetoric 1, English 101. I got the date wrong there. It's actually week 11. So I think I got the wrong date up there. Sorry about that. April 8th to April 4th to April 8th. But we're going to just talk really briefly. I'll talk very briefly about Sonny's Blues, the second part. Hopefully you've started reading this. If you haven't, that's all right, because we haven't started writing about Sonny's Blues except for our journals and reading summaries. But this is the last short story. So if you're keeping up with the short stories, you might be glad to hear that this is the last one that we'll be reading this semester. And last week I provided a couple of links. So if you wanted to pause the video and get these links and check these out, one of them is just a little bit, it's just Wikipedia. You could just search this in Google, but it's just a little bit of information about James Baldwin. And I'll share a little bit more about him once we get into writing our essay. Not that you have to know that, but sometimes it's helpful to know a little bit about the author because he was such an important cultural figure in terms of the civil rights movement and all kinds of things, and so on. And then also this is just a video that's somebody talking about Sonny's Blues, and I think they talk about it in a really accessible way. So if you're having trouble with, as we keep talking about this story, you may want to go back and look at this. It's just a really pretty quick summary video and just kind of, down to earth and practical. So if you want to look at that, you can look at that too. So Sonny's Blues, this is the second section from page 494 to 503. So if you can take a look at that for our journal and answer these 3 questions. Anything else you want to write in your journal is always fine. Remember, your journal is a place where you can write anything you want to, but I'm always going to give you journal prompts. But you can also write about other things. If things are going on in your life or whatever, your journal is a place to do that. It's really just a way for me to, I do the same thing in English 088 if you took that class with me, where the journals, I give you a prompt, but I always know that a journal is a place where people record thoughts and ideas and other things. And we'll hand those in, remember, at the end of the semester. So if you're not caught up, there's still time to do them. And that's the same way with our reading summaries. I'll collect those at the end of the semester. So on page 494, the narrator's mother tells him a story about his uncle. It's a terrible, kind of horrific story about how he died, murdered, really. And why do you think the narrator remembers this story? So again, as you read this story, try to think about in the context, how does it relate to Sonny? Remember the story, Sonny's Blues. The narrator is the older brother, and his mother shares this story and on page 494, and it's it's a terrible story. But what's the point, do you think? Why is she sharing this with her older son, thinking about maybe her younger son, because they were brothers, obviously the father and his brother, and so it's this idea, responsibility maybe, but take a look at that part, and that's a question. After the funeral of his mother, that's a little later on page 496, the narrator talks with Sonny. Sonny tells the narrator he wants to join the military even though he's too young, and he wants to be a jazz musician. The narrator tries to convince Sonny not to join the military and questions his desire to be a musician. So the question I had here is just for you to maybe think about this part where the older brother is trying to convince, he's thinking, you don't want to join the military, you're too young, you're going to have to lie about your age. I believe this is wartime during the Korean War, it's in the 50s. And then they never say exactly the year, but I think it's about that time. And then, this question here, have you ever had a similar conversation with anyone? And if you wanted to imagine this, you could either be the person trying to give advice or the person somebody's trying to give you advice, trying to talk you into something or talk you out of some decision that you're trying to make in your life. But especially this idea of if you're trying to convince someone else to change, something. They're planning to do something and you want them to do something else, especially, it's not maybe like the level of going to a movie or where we're going to have dinner, but, life kind of things that are very serious about work and school and different things that we might do. So how'd it go when you try to convince that person? How do you imagine Sonny and his brother, the narrator, feel during their talk? As you read it, you can sense it probably, that there's a lot of tension between the two of them as the older brother tries to steer the younger brother toward the things that he thinks would be better for him, and the younger brother's kind of resistant to that. You'll see as you look at it. On page 502, we learn that the narrator's daughter died of polio, which was in the 50s. That was a very serious disease. It's almost like when the early pandemic, we didn't have a vaccine or anything. And people were, for a little while at least, and maybe now still, but more so I think a couple of years ago, people were very terrified of getting COVID and that there wouldn't be any cure or anything. And polio was like that for many, many years, a different kind of disease. But if you wanted to look that up, you could even just Google polio and see if you don't know too much about that. But it was a major thing in the 1950s and before. And then there was a vaccine that was developed. And so almost nobody, I think, these days suffers from that. It's rare. How do you think this death, though, affects Sonny? Imagine his young daughter. dying, and then he's got this younger brother who he feels responsible for. So this plays into all the emotion of the story. Again, as you read the story, you'll know a lot more what I'm talking about. This will make more sense. So if you haven't read, the story, once you read these pages, you might want to go back and look at this video or just look at these questions again. Again, I'll put these in Blackboard in week 11's file. The questions for the reading summary, very similar, same section, 594 to 503, but I just asked a couple of more specific questions. Again, on page 495, after the mother tells a story of how the uncle died, she says, I ain't telling you this to make you scared or bitter. I'm telling you this because you got a brother and the world ain't changed. So what does the mother mean by this? And in what ways is the world today still the same as it was for Sonny's, and the narrator's father and uncle, and for them too in the 1950s? How is it still maybe the same? And some of the things that the mother's really concerned about, wanting her to be aware that he has this brother. On page 499, when asked by his brother why he wants to join the army, Sonny says to get out of Harlem. So this one I wanted to let you think a little bit about. If you've ever known anyone who joined the military or maybe took a job or moved somewhere hoping that that new place or situation would really change their lives. It doesn't have to be the military, but it could be. And how did that work out? I certainly have done that in my life. I've made changes, moved, lived in different places, thinking that was going to, some people call those geographical cures, right? We're kind of sick of the way life is in one place and we think it might be better in another place. And, there are differences in different parts of the world and different cities and so on. But how does that work? Or have you ever had an experience with that? Because Sonny seems to be thinking if he can just get out of Harlem in New York, and where he could just have a different life. And certainly James Baldwin, his life, he spent quite a bit of his life living in Europe, I think mostly in France. So he experienced that, kind of moving to another place. And I think he always came back to the U.S., but he lived abroad a lot. So anyway, that's something to think about. The narrator convinces Sonny, this last question, not to join the military, and instead to stay in school and to live with the family of Isabel. That's the narrator's girlfriend at the time, because they're not married yet. But Sonny lies about going to school and instead spends his time playing piano. He's obsessed with it, right? He's a talented musician and he loves playing the piano, and it's all he can think about. So this question, I was just thinking, have you ever been obsessed about anything like Sonny is about music? If so, how did the obsession affect your school, work, personal relationships, or any part of your life? So these are just some things to reflect on. But again, if you want to cover something else as you're trying to summarize the reading, and remember, our summaries you don't have to write a lot. You may write 3 or 4 sentences. It might be just a good paragraph or 2 for the summaries and the journals each week. It's not a lot of writing, but it allows you to just reflect on what we're reading. And remember, these are not due until the end of the semester, and we haven't started writing about Sonny's Blues yet, but we're going to be ahead of that. And so when we finally do get to start writing about Sonny's Blues, hopefully you've read the story and it'll make the writing go a lot easier. And that is, I think, all I have for the reading lecture this week. And again, as always, let me know if you have any questions, and I'll stop it here and I will go ahead and move on to the next one, which, if you haven't watched, I'm going to do a little bit longer rhetoric and writing, should be about 15 minutes, cover a couple of things in that. So thanks again for watching.